Hello, it's Jace again. Welcome to episode 3 of my discussion about some of my favorite historical aircraft. Today, continuing on my what could have been done differently train of thought, I want to discuss the firepower of the Me-109. As I mentioned in the end of the previous video, where I discussed propellers of the Me-109, I mentioned that one of the reasons they didn't want to change the type of propellers they were using is because Nazi Germany didn't want to give up the firepower of the main gun that fired through the hollow crankshaft and out the propeller hub. So today, let me continue with a discussion about the weapons mounted on board the Me-109, and the options that Nazi Germany had available to them, and what they could have done differently with those options. And then, when it's all laid out, I think we'll be able to understand why they chose to do what they did, much as we came to the conclusion earlier in the discussion of episode 2, of why they stuck with 3-bladed propellers and never changed to 4-bladed propellers. Let's start by defining the standard weaponry of the Me-109. There were lots of different combinations of weapons from the early model airplanes, but today we're going to focus on the Me-109G. Yes, there was also A through F designated models of the airplane, but these mid and late war G models account for the bulk of the number produced, accounting for some 2/3 of all airframes flown. The other earlier models had less powerful engines, and while not always fewer in number, they bore smaller caliber weapons. The most numerous G model had some of the heaviest standard armament, and for the sake of the discussion, that's a good thing. The standard internal weaponry consisted of 3 guns. 2 Mg151 machine guns chambered in the 13x64mm cartridge. They were mounted behind the engine in front of the pilot, synchronized with the propeller to fire through the ports in the cowling, and fed by 300 rounds per gun, for a total of 600 rounds. The rate of fire was reduced by the synchronizing mechanism that let the guns shoot through the propeller, but they were extremely accurate because both guns were right there in the nose. Whatever the plane was pointing at, the plane was shooting at, without having to mess around with the complicated convergence settings that you would have to with the wing-mounted machine guns in other planes, like the P-47 that I used in the first episode as an example. The rate of fire of these guns could have also been even further reduced if they'd used a 4-blade propeller, which was something I did not mention in the second video of this series.
We're ahead of the enemy.
And if the rate of fire had been reduced, this would have reduced their effectiveness even more. In addition to these 2 13mm machine guns, there was also an autocannon, the weapon I mentioned before that fired through the hollow crankshaft and out the propeller hub. Some models were equipped with the Mg151/20 20mm cannon and loaded with 200 rounds. Later models that were equipped with the U4 upgrade had the Mg151/20 superseded by the Mk108 30mm autocannon, and that was fed with only 65 rounds. Another available option is some strange Russian word that I'm not going to be able to pronounce correctly. It is spelled Rustsatz. Rustsatz? The Rustsatz 6 upgrade kit mounted 2 Mg151/20 20mm autocannons in gun pods, one under each wing. Each one loaded with 135 rounds.
Destroy the target.
I've heard that, despite the added firepower, they weren't very popular with the pilots. The added weight out of the wings reduced the Me-109's roll rate, and being mounted on the wings, they had to be slightly more carefully aligned. They weren't as accurate or as concentrated as the other 3 guns, all packed into the nose of the aircraft. So many pilots didn't bother mounting them, foregoing the extra firepower so that their speed and maneuverability wasn't hampered by the weight and drag of the gun pods. That is the configuration you see me flying in the aircraft in the game in War Thunder in the background, with 3 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Now, let me go on a bit of a tangent here, and when I'm done you'll see why it's relevant. One thing I have learned with the military, especially with German naming conventions, is that, while it's not obvious, Everything has meaning. For example, the Mg131 machine gun is 13mm, yet the Mg151/20 is a 20mm autocannon. Why does it have the MG designation like a machine gun, and doesn't the 151 mean it's a 15mm machine gun? Yes, it does. That is exactly correct. The Mg151 is a 15mm machine gun. In their quest to squeeze ever more firepower out of the ME-109, the Mg151 was quickly superseded by the Mg151/20, which is the 20mm autocannon. The Mg151 and the Mg151/20 are exactly the same weapon, just rebarreled to be chambered in different cartridges. The Mg151 is chambered in the rare 15 by 96mm cartridge, and the Mg151/20 is chambered in the 20 by 82mm cartridge, which was, in essence, the same casing as the 15mm round, just necked up so it was thicker to take the 2cm projectile instead of the 1.5cm projectile. This discovery of the Mg151 15mm machine gun got me thinking. It was new to me, and I got shot down. So let me set something else up so I can keep rolling footage while I talk about this.
Attention to the designated grid square.
The Mg151 machine gun got me thinking. It was new to me. I hadn't heard of it before. And I knew that not only was the number of guns part of the limiting factor, but also the number of rounds carried was a problem. The MG109, in the ME-109's case, there were 800 rounds shared between the three guns. And if it was equipped with the 30mm cannon, it only carried 667 rounds. That's not much ammo, especially in comparison with the 3,400 rounds carried for the P-47's 8 guns. So the idea came to me, could the 15 by 96mm cartridge from the Mg151-15 be a better all-purpose cartridge when compared to the combination of two 13mm and one 20mm guns? The 15 by 96mm cartridge has more power and more oomph than the American 50 cal and the German 13mm, but it's smaller. It's smaller and lighter and probably has a higher rate of fire than the 20 or 30mm guns. Which, is a trading game. Smaller and lighter means less damage, but a higher rate of fire means more likely to score a hit. Comparing the 12 by 96 cartridge directly to the 20 by 82 cartridge of the Mg151/20, it has a higher rate of fire, as I already said, but it also has a higher muzzle velocity by, let me check, depending on the projectile loaded, anywhere from 150 to 300 meters per second. That's a pretty wide margin. 300 meters per second. And not just 300 meters per second faster, 300 meters per second, not in total, but faster. Comparing the 15mm to the 13mm, this also means more damage and more range because of the heavier bullets. Even with comparable velocity, the extra weight means more kinetic energy, and more kinetic energy means not just more damage, but being able to maintain energy over a longer distance. On top of that, it'd be a simplified supply chain. You'd only have, with planes only using one type of ammunition instead of two different kinds. It sounds great, right? In practice, it's not that simple. I know, it never is. Back in the 1940s, when they were making these types of ammunition, the 20mm carried way more explosive mass than the 15mm. By explosive mass, I mean actual explosives inside the projectile. Neither the 15mm or the 20mm were inert pieces of metal, but rather a hollow shell filled with explosives and a detonator to set off this kaboom. Much like the shell of a tank or a warship, just smaller. The 15mm round for the machine gun is made like a traditional cast bullet, After manufacturing, the projectile is then drilled out and the payload, the explosive, is put inside the hollow space. So in practice, it's about 20 to 25% heavier and more lethal than the regular 50 Browning machine gun cartridge or the 13mm cartridge from the Mg131, because their downrange performance for the 50 BMG and 13mm in this case, because of their similar downrange performance, for the sake of this discussion, they're comparable. So the 15mm is better than both in terms of purely destructive power. The 20mm, however, being slightly larger, can be manufactured by a different process, where the thin-walled shell is not cast in a mold like a regular bullet, but rather is made by drawing the steel in much the same way the case for the cartridge is made, allowing for much thinner shell walls while still retaining structural strength enough to withstand the G-forces of being fired out of a gun, allowing for 25% larger 20mm rounds to carry 30 to 35% more magical boom powder inside of them than compared to the 15mm rounds, which was in turn a 20% improvement over the comparable 12.7 or 13mm cartridges used in other typical weapons, letting this 20mm cannon pack nearly twice as much airplane-stopping boom power as the 12.7 or 13mm machine guns that were typically mounted on the fighters of the time. So in actuality, the 20mm is in a whole different bomber-killing league of its own when compared to the 15, 13, or 12.7mm heavy machine guns. So that's why they liked keeping the autocannon rather than the trio of heavy machine guns. Even the one 20mm gun and two 13mm guns is still collectively carries more oomph than three 15mm guns, even though the 15mm guns are both significant improvements over the 13mm. So, as a reasonable suggestion for an alternate loadout, would it be possible to arm all these planes with two 20mm guns with larger magazines, not bother with the smaller caliber guns at all? After all, the Mg151/20 is the same physical dimensions as the Mg151/15, and they're not too much larger than the Mg131, so maybe you could fit a pair in the cowling, right? But they didn't do that either, for multiple reasons. Firstly, these thin-walled projectiles, the ones that gave it the ability to carry such large plane-killing explosive mass, meant they broke up easily when they made direct contact with the target. So if you shot something that wasn't a plane, like, say, during a strafing run, or, a tank on the ground, the shell would deform and detonate on the outside. And unless the armor was thin enough that the explosion would penetrate it, it would do little to no damage. The 13mm guns had more penetration power, so they kept the smaller guns for hitting ground targets. And it's not that you could just use different armor-piercing projectiles in the 20mm gun. The Mg151/20 and the Mg151/15 are the same gun and the same cartridge. All they did was neck up the bullet and change barrels. This means the 20mm round, as I mentioned earlier, is slower than the 15mm round. This also means less range and lower velocity. Lower velocity means less armor penetration, whether you use high explosive or armor penetrating ammo in the 20mm. Doesn't matter. The higher velocity 13mm from the Mg131 is still better at armor penetrating than the Mg151/20. I'm not sure how the Mg151/15 compares between them. I suspect it would carry the most penetrating power. I know my personal suspicion doesn't count for much in this academic discussion. But let's not forget there were other guns besides the Mg151/20 and the Mg131. We can't forget the 30mm autocannons. They might have used the same high explosive bullets in larger, more powerful cases, and guns like the MK108, or the Mark 108, as I want to call it. I'm not sure which is the proper way. These 30mm cannons, by necessity, were larger, heavier guns with lower ammo capacity, lower rate of fire. and some were too big and or too recoil heavy to be put on single-engine fighters like the Me-109. For example, the Mk103 or the Mark 103. They couldn't use those either, despite the better performance against both air and ground targets. The Mk103 is also a 30mm autocannon like the Mk108. They use the same projectile, but those projectiles are loaded into different cartridges, and the Mk103 cannon has a much longer, more powerful cartridge. For comparison's sake, these bigger 30mm bullets hold even more explosive mass and do more damage to planes. The Mk108 30mm gun, like in the Me-262 and some models of the Me-109, had 30 to 35% increase in bang over the 20mm, which had something between 2.5 and 3.5 times more power than the 13mm or 50 caliber machine guns when used on air targets. But like the 20mm, they were low velocity and had poor armor penetration due to the way the shell was manufactured, making them unable to punch through more than what the explosive mass could blast through. Low muzzle velocity meant that other types of rounds, such as solid armor penetrator rounds for use against tanks and such targets, were again poor performers. Just like with the 20mm, there were more powerful versions using the same 30mm projectile with a bigger case, making a larger overall cartridge with more powder in a larger, heavier recoil, a larger, heavier gun that also had heavier recoil, which was the Mk103 I mentioned earlier. And those were mostly used on ground-based anti-aircraft weapons because the recoil made it hard for them to be used on a plane. A small, light, single-engine plane like the Me-109 is just too restricting. This combination of 13mm machine guns and 20mm or later 30mm cannons gives you the best performance in terms of both high explosive rounds to knock out big 4-engine strategic bombers in as few hits as possible, and the most armor-penetrating ability to attack ground targets, just like my earlier talk with propellers, why the Nazis never converted from the 3-blade to 4-blade propellers. I now understand why they used the weapons they did, and didn't convert to other types of calibers or other guns. Hopefully, that made sense to everyone else too. My original idea of these 3 15mm Mg151s would carry less boom than my other suggestion of 2 Mg151/20s, but would have better armor penetrating ability. But that ability would only be marginally more than the 13mm Mg131, and that's why this heavy intermediate round was deemed superfluous and removed from production altogether, simplifying the supply chain. Especially when the two 13mm guns have an even higher rate of fire and larger magazine capacity and lower weight than the 15mm guns, thus increasing the likelihood of a hit, even if those hits do less damage, because a small hit is better than a miss. And if two 20mm cans are mounted and no 13mm guns, it would have been better for knocking down other planes, but would have had almost no armor penetrating ability, preventing such planes from being used as fighter bombers. And at the end of the war, when they were being pressed from all sides and angles, they needed all the versatility and options they could get. Plus, for all I know, the Mg151/20 is too large and couldn't fit in the place of the Mg131 behind the engine, center gun removed or not. Nor could they go to the even bigger 30mm guns, because of the sheer size and recoil, not to mention lower round count on board the airplane, and a lower rate of fire, again lowering the probability of scoring hits. So in hindsight, what the Nazis did was the best choice they had available at the time with resources they were given. So my middle-of-the-road 15mm idea I liked was quickly superseded by the 20mm cannon and 13mm machine gun combination. The Mg151/15 was only used for 1941. As they were phased out in 1942, the armor-penetrating performance of the 15mm was, in practice, only 5 to 10% better than the 13mm, and being 20 to 25% less powerful than the 20mm against airplanes, the choice seems kind of obvious now. By contrast, the American planes with their 6 or 8 50 caliber machine guns worked through sheer volume of fire, The 50 BMG was a narrower, longer bullet and had a higher muzzle velocity than the Germans' 13mm, making it about the same in armor-penetrating performance as the 15 by 96mm cartridge in the Mg151/15, which works great for ground pounding and allows for higher rates of fire and more rounds carried so that you can stay in the fight longer. That's part of why they didn't deviate from the 650's standard, not until after the F-86, excuse me. And the F-86 was, what, a decade later? And sure, it doesn't have all the explosive wallop of a 20mm or 30mm cannon, but remember, the US planes had 6 or 8 guns, and the 109s only had 3 guns. My earlier example of the P-47 with 8 machine guns and 3,400 rounds. But let the Americans be Americans and spray bullets everywhere, making up for the less explosive mass by just making a boatload of hits. What really limited the 109 was the Me-109's thin wings. It was an older 1930s design that started with a weak engine, so they built it with thin wings to make it fast and more maneuverable, but that prevented them from mounting more firepower in the wings. I know I mentioned gun pods, and they mounted both the 20mm cannons and the Mk108, was the Mk103. They mounted both 20 and 30mm cannons in gun pods, but those also increased drag, reduced roll rate, and so they paid a price for that too. And as I mentioned earlier, they had other versions. I mentioned in the previous video, I should clarify, not just earlier in this video, in a previous video I mentioned other earlier versions of the 109s carrying more guns. They tried mounting smaller machine guns in the wings of the plane, but the wings were so thin they had to cut a chunk out of the wing spars in order to have a trough for the gun to sit in, and that actually made the wings weaker, and you could literally break your own airplane if you turned too hard. So they quickly stopped doing that too. Anyway, here endeth the lesson on guns. Next time, join me for a lesson on why the DB605 engine was amazing, and the performance Germany got out of it was amazing too, especially with the synthetic fuel that they had. Really, I think they lost because they didn't have enough gas to keep fielding planes. Join me next time for the 4th and final episode of the series, where I talk about engines and how they drug this aircraft along way past its service life and managed to keep them as a dangerous opponent well into 1944 and 1945. So please, stay tuned for the next episode, the 4th and final part of this discussion, where we get to my favorite part of old airplanes: big, fire-breathing piston engines. If you've been enjoying this, please consider leaving a like or a comment to help drive the YouTube algorithm so that we can spread this knowledge and discussion to all who are interested. And to anyone who is interested, I am a science fiction author, and my book, The Descendant, is available on Amazon, and the link for that will be down in the description if you want to take a look at it. And if you do happen to pick up a copy, I would greatly appreciate it if you left a review for the book on Amazon. Much like how the YouTube algorithm needs to be driven? I don't know, I'm an author, I should know that. Much how the YouTube algorithm needs to be fed with likes and comments, the Amazon algorithm needs to be fed with reviews in order to help me in my book. So, I'd greatly appreciate it if you gave my book a look. I'll see you in the next one.